It is not that God justifies godly people. Godly people do not need to be justified. But how many godly people are there? None. No, not one. You see, God Himself justifies the ungodly. Well, that's the one who his faith is reckoned to him. It's applied to him as righteousness, even though he's not righteous. So you see that word reckon happened 3 times already in this paragraph? We're going to really look at that word later. His faith is reckoned as righteousness. That's what we need. We want the righteousness. Just as, in the same way that David. So we've already saw what God said about Abraham. Now we're going to see what David said. David also speaks of the blessing. Man, I want to be blessed. Who wants a blessing? Man, I want a blessing. God speaks of the blessing upon the man to whom God reckons righteousness apart from works. There it is again. Man, I would like for God to reckon, to see me as righteous even though I'm not righteous, and seeing me as righteous has nothing to do with my works. That would be great. Whom God reckons righteousness apart from, and that's that word we talked about last week, chorus. Has no connection with. It's a giant chasm between it and faith. Righteousness apart from works. And here is where David speaks this blessing. Actually, it's 2 blessings. Verse 7. This blessing is in Psalms chapter 32, verse 1 and 2. Here's the blessing he's talking about. Blessed are those whose lawless deeds have been forgiven. Ah, that is a blessing. And whose sins have been covered. And the next blessing is in verse 8. Come on, machine, here we go. The next blessing is verse 8. Blessed is the man whose sin the Lord will not take into account. That into account, that's that word again. God's not going to take your sin and apply it to your account book. He's not going to reckon it to your account. You end up standing free as if you never sinned before in your life. Man, that is a very nice gift. I'd like to open up a present someday at Christmas, and the present said, sins forgiven from now to the end of time. Oh, wow, really? You kidding? I mean, no more sins? I mean, what if I make a mistake tomorrow? Nope, it's forgiven. Oh, what if I make a mistake the next day? Nope, forgiven. Whoa, that would be a great blessing, wouldn't it? And here's David saying, blessed is the one whose lawless deeds have been forgiven. But more than that, blessed is the man whose sin, that means future ones, the Lord will not even put on the account books. Wow, that is a blessing. I cannot imagine a blessing stronger than that, and that will not. In Greek, it's a double negative followed by an aorist middle subjunctive. Now, we don't want to go through a bunch of grammar and explain that, but the point of that is, it is a very strong negative. He will not. Maybe in English, if you switch the will and the not, it would bring out the point. He shall not. Put it on your account book. Now, that is a great blessing to have. And so we've got this accounting into account connected with the word reckon because it's the exact same word in Greek. So all through here, things are being reckoned to us that's not really an accurate description of us. It's just looked upon that way. We'll see it some more when we get to this next paragraph, 13 to 25. We're jumping right in the middle of this paragraph. Maybe we'll go back and look at the other in some other lesson someday. But here he continues that thought and says, just as it is written, a father of many nations, and this, as it is written, comes from Genesis 17:5. We'll look at it later. A father of many nations have I made you. And here's Abraham. He's 100 years old. He doesn't even have one child. How can he have many nations? To have many nations means he needs to have many children, and each of those children have many, many, many children until they become the U.S. nation, the Philippine nation, the Guatemalan nation. He's thinking, I don't even have one, and now you're saying you, a father of many nations have I made you? Look at the word made. What tense is that? Is that past, present, or future? Here's a man with no child, and God already says, I made you. He didn't say, I will make you. He didn't say you are. He said, I made you. It's done deal. It's over with. It's as good as happened. I made you a father of many nations. Now, here's the passage, verse 5. Neither shall thy name anymore be called Abram, but thy name shall be Abraham. For the father of a multitude of nations have I already made you. It's already happened. It's there. It's done, and you can't even see it yet. And Abraham is going, what? You know, I don't even have one child. How can you say I've already got many nations under me? Where's that at? What kind of God are you that could make such a statement? As it is written, a father of many nations have I made you. In the sight of him who had believed. Abraham believed that. And I would think, you know, this is a con man trying to do something if somebody told me that. But Abraham believed it. He believed God. Now, why would he believe God? It's God who. Now, the description we see that follows is the reason why Abraham could believe that God had already made him the father of many nations. Now, what kind of God is he? Well, number one, he's the God who gives life to the dead. Now, you might think, of course, at the end of time. I'm not sure that's it. What other kind of God is he? And he calls things that are not as though they were. Now, what is this dead that God gives life to? And because God can do that, it makes Abraham believe that God could give Abraham as many children as there are stars in the sky. Well, it's on down in the paragraph. Let's see what they are. Notice in verse 19, and without becoming weak in faith, Abraham contemplated his own body, now as good as dead, since he was about 100 years old, and the deadness of Sarah's womb. Now, this is the dead thing God can bring back to life. What he's bringing back to life is, that's really hard for me to do in a church audience. Think about what he's bringing back to life. He's bringing back to life their dead reproductive organs. That's a nice way to say it. So here's Abraham. We'll get there in a second. So he knows God can bring my dead reproductive organs back to life. That's what he meant when he said gives life to the dead. And number two, he calls things that are not. What are these things that are not that God speaks of as though they were? Well, it's that he has many nations. I'm getting whatever it is that half of this congregation's already got, I'm afraid. He's calling the fact that he has made him many nations. He knows that God can say that before the fact and it be just as sure as it's already happened anyway. That's the kind of God he is. Therefore, Abraham says, I can believe you. And then he says in verse 18, in hope against hope. What does it mean, in hope against hope? Well, when Abraham looks at himself, when he was 20 years old, couldn't get Sarah pregnant. When he was 40 years old, he still couldn't get Sarah pregnant. When he was 50 years old, he still couldn't get Sarah pregnant. Now, we're not talking about a time when people lived to be 700 years old. This is after the flood. When God had already said 70 years is the average lifespan. He's past the average lifespan. He's a wrinkled up, swiveled up old man who's lucky if he can walk with a set of canes around him. He's 100 years old, and he couldn't have a baby when he was 20. He couldn't have one when he was 40. He couldn't produce a child when he was 60, and now he's 100. And here's what he says. It doesn't work anymore. I don't know exactly how far I can make this clear, but he's saying it doesn't work anymore. So, in hope against hope. Maybe he knew that God knew the secret to some of these medicine we see advertised on TV all the time. I don't know what the deal is, but God knew how to make those things work again. And hope against hope, he believed. There was no reason to believe it, but he said, okay, God, I don't know how you're going to do it, but I know you can bring life to my dead reproductive organs. In order to that, now, because he believed, he trusted God when there was no reason to believe it, in order that he might become the father of many nations, according to just like it had been spoken. And here's what was spoken. He took him outside and said, now look toward the heavens and count the stars if you're able to count them. That's how many kids you're going to have. So shall your descendants be. And without becoming weak in faith. Now what does that mean? You see, that word believed and faith are all the same word in Greek. He faithed God. He faithed in order it would happen. Without becoming weak in faith, he's continuing to trust God that God can do it. He contemplated his own body as good as dead. Physically, he knew, I cannot produce a baby. But he's promising me as many as there are stars in the sky. And he looked at his wife, and her womb is dead. Yet, with respect to the promise, what promise is he talking about? That I can have as many children as there are stars in the sky. He did not waver in unbelief. That's that same word faith again. It just has an alpha in front of it. It means no. He faithed God. He faithed God. He faithed God. He did not stop faithing God, but he grew strong. That but is that strong but again, completely different than losing his trust in God. He grew strong in faith. Now look at this last point. Instead of being in unbelief, he had faith when there's no reason to faith, but he was giving glory to God. Now remember how this paragraph began? What does Abraham, our forefather, have to say about this? Did he have something to glory about? And the answer is no. He knew it's the God who can make my dead reproductive organs work again. It's the God who can say, I'm a father of many nations, even though they are